I never thought I would keep a record of this, but I need to put it somewhere, because if I keep it only in my head, it will drive me insane. I keep telling myself that this is real, that I am not imagining it, because I can hear it even when I try not to. I can hear it now as I write, scratching faint and steady, as if something is dragging a nail against the wall right behind the wallpaper. The house was not old when I moved in. It was built in the early 90s, a small 2-story home with bland beige siding and a half-finished basement. Nothing about it felt ominous when I first toured it. I took comfort in the clean paint, the neutral smell of carpet shampoo, the empty walls. I told myself I would fill it with life, with my books and framed photos and mismatched furniture. That was what I wanted most, to finally feel settled. The first week was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I lived in an apartment before this, and I was used to the sound of neighbors moving above me, televisions muffled through walls, the constant drone of cars outside. Here there was none of that. At night, it was so silent that I could hear the thump of my own heartbeat in my ears. I remember standing in the upstairs hallway one night, listening to the stillness, and feeling the strange thought that the house was listening to me too. The scratching began on the 8th night. It was faint at first, a sound I almost missed because I thought it was only branches against the siding. But there were no trees near that wall. It was the north wall of the bedroom, the one covered in faded floor wallpaper. I lay awake, staring into the dark, listening to the faint rhythmic scrape. 1 pause, 2 pause, 3. It sounded deliberate, almost patterned. I told myself it was mice. Houses got them all the time. Old insulation made perfect nests, and the scratching was just tiny claws finding their way between the studs. I even convinced myself it was a good thing. A normal explanation meant nothing was wrong, but I could not shake the sense that it was not coming from inside the wall itself. It sounded closer, like it was being made just behind the thin layer of wallpaper. Like something pressed between the plaster and the paper skin was dragging its nails just inches from my face. The sound stopped whenever I got out of bed. I tried to catch it. I would fling off the blankets, cross the floor, press my ear to the wall. Nothing. Only silence. Then when I returned to bed, when my eyes began to drift, the sound would return. The next morning, I peeled up a corner of wallpaper near the baseboard. I half expected to see the plaster shredded or at least marked, but it was smooth, blank, cold beneath my fingertips. I knocked and heard only the hollow thump of drywall. No nests, no rodents. The scratching returned the following night. It grew bolder. I could hear it traveling, moving from the baseboard up to the middle of the wall, then higher, until it reached near the headboard where I slept. It followed me as if it knew exactly where my ears were. When I shifted to the other side of the bed, the sound shifted too. Always just behind me, always within reach, if I were only reckless enough to tear the paper wide open. I told myself again and again to ignore it, that the sound was nothing more than the settling of the house, the friction of wood, maybe even my own nerves. But on the 11th night, I heard something new. A tap, sharp and distinct, like a fingernail hitting from inside the wall. One tap, then silence. Another, then silence. I counted 7 in total before it went quiet again. My mouth went dry, and I whispered into the room, though my voice sounded strange in the empty house. I whispered stop. The scratching answered. I barely slept after that. Every time I began to close my eyes, the noise returned. Sometimes it was faint and distant. Other times it was so close I swore the wallpaper bulged toward me, as if something pressed from behind. I started spending more time downstairs, telling myself I just preferred the couch. But even there, late at night, I could hear the faintest drag from the wall behind the television. Always on the other side of the wallpaper. Always hidden. One night, after a long stretch of restless sleep, I woke to find something new. On the wall near the bedroom door, a long vertical tear had appeared in the wallpaper. It was not there when I went to bed. It ran nearly 2 feet, a pale strip of plaster visible beneath. I examined it with shaking hands. The edges of the tear curled outward as though something had pushed from beneath. I convinced myself I had done it in my sleep, that I must have gotten up disoriented and pulled at the wallpaper without remembering. But that did not explain why my fingertips were clean, why no scraps of paper littered the floor. The tear was neat, deliberate, as if cut. I spent that day at work staring at my monitor, unable to focus. Every time the office was quiet, I imagined faint scratches just beneath the surface of the walls around me. I imagined the sound traveling with me, waiting. By the time I drove home, my chest was tight with dread. That night, I could not resist. I pulled back more of the wallpaper, revealing a square of plaster beneath. Smooth, unmarked, perfectly ordinary. I pressed my palm against it. Cold, silent. Nothing moved beneath. But when I lay back in bed, lights off, the sound returned immediately, scratching exactly where I had uncovered the wall, only now it was louder, closer, almost as if my removing the barrier had invited it nearer. I remember lying frozen, listening, and realizing with terrible certainty that this was not a mouse. This was not the house settling. Something was behind the wallpaper, something that could move. Something that could scratch. I tried to rationalize it for days. I bought traps, placed them along the baseboards, checked them every morning. Nothing. No droppings, no chewed wires, no evidence of life at all. Only the scratches. I stopped peeling the wallpaper after that. I was too afraid of what I might see if I tore too much away. But the wallpaper tore itself. New splits appeared overnight, small at first, then longer. Thin lines clawed downward, some only a few inches, others nearly reaching the floor. Always vertical, always as if something with sharp nails had dragged them from behind. I called a contractor, told him I thought the walls had water damage or maybe structural shifting. He came one afternoon, walked the perimeter, tapped with his knuckles, and told me everything looked sound. No leaks, no moisture, no sign of pests. He shrugged when I asked about the wallpaper, said it probably just aged poorly, and suggested I replace it. That night, while I lay awake staring at the fresh tears, the scratching began again. Louder, closer, more insistent. And then, for the first time, I heard something beneath the scratching. A breath, slow and deliberate, drawn in on the other side of the thin wall, held for a moment, then released in a long rasp that made the wallpaper quiver against my cheek. I did not sleep at all. I sat up with the lamp burning until morning, eyes fixed on the wall, waiting for another sound. The breath did not return, but the scratches never stopped. After the first month, the scratches stopped being random and became a language I could not decode. They multiplied into patterns, and the house no longer felt like mine. The vertical score marks that had once been small and isolated began to map an itinerary across rooms, bedrooms, living room, hallway. Even the back of a kitchen cabinet bore faint pale gutters where the wallpaper had been forced outward and split as if something inside had been. trying to write its way out the tears rarely crossed. Baseboards instead, they seemed content to climb like veins toward the ceiling, always reaching not for floors, but for head height, as if whatever scratch preferred to be level with eyes. I try to document everything with pictures, scribbles, and voice notes, so that when the terror accumulated, I would have a ledger to keep me sane. The first photo I took of an especially long tear came back with a smear in the print, like condensation, though the air in the room had been dry. My hand trembled as I scrolled through the images, and sometimes the scratches in the photos looked deeper and narrower than in person, as if film compressed the wound and brought it closer. I placed a small strip of tape beneath a long, fresh abrasion to measure growth, and woke the next morning to find the tape torn and folded upward, the mark underneath darker, and the edges lifting like a scab. At night, the house learned to be noisier. It developed tiny micro rhythms, a creak at 2:13 a.m., as if a hinge had learned to clear its throat, a faint thud at 3:07, like a heartbeat, one wall producing a whisper, while another remained obediently mute. The scratches appeared to follow that rhythm, and not even when every light burned did the pattern relent. I began to move my books away from shelves that backed the worst walls. I dragged furniture so that nothing sat on the sides of the house. I slept in the center of the room, and still the noise pursed up and found me. Neighbors noticed the changes before friends did. They commented on the way my curtains hung crooked or how my garbage bin was always oddly placed in the alley. They never asked about the scratches directly, but their eyes lingered where the wallpaper peeled and then darted away. The neighborhood has a way of seeing what it wants and ignoring what it cannot. Assimilate. A woman from 2 houses down brought me a casserole one afternoon when I had been awake for more than 60 hours. She said the casserole was for comfort, and then delivered a line about houses and their histories, as if she expected me to nod and understand what that meant. And I had to keep my mouth closed because I did not want to say aloud the word I had started to fear the most. Lived, as if I said it aloud, I might give it permission. I went to the library looking for records, land, the history of the road, anything that might tell me whether the house had a past that could explain the insistence beneath its walls. The librarian was patient and old and had a soft bruise of memory behind her eyes, as if she had kept things she could not discard. She pulled out a thin folder with photocopies of a newspaper column and a scan council note. A family had lived here in the late 70s. The piece said 2 children, a small woman who painted wallpaper murals in secret, and a man who left in the night and did not return. The house had been sold and renovated once and then again, but something about that family had been mentioned in the local rumor mill. The note contained a faint line about a child who liked to carve initials into walls with a key, and the librarian tapped the photocopy as if to show me that history likes to leave receipts. I did not tell her that my bedroom had once been painted with a floral motif similar to the one in the old photograph, and I did not tell her that I found the same faint kiss of color under my torn strips of modern paper, as if the house retained memory like a photograph beneath the varnish. I left the library with a photocopy of the article and a number of contacts scribbled on the back of a receipt, as if the town wanted me to call and talk and be reasonable. Calling did not help. Callers are human. The first man I spoke with over the phone was a contractor who suggested replacing the drywall. He said it would be expensive and perhaps unnecessary. He discounted the notion of scratching as a symptom. He said homes settle and wallpaper delaminates, and sometimes plaster sheds in long lines for reasons tied to humidity. I wanted to tell him about breath, but I could not find the sound of the word with his voice over the line, It felt too frivolous, speaking panic into a polite suggestion about materials. I installed a baby monitor because reasoning had become insufficient. I wanted to record what happened in those hours. My eyes would not be open to witness the recordings over the first week. Captured nothing overt, though once a faint rasp appears in the audio between 3:10 and 3:14 a.m., the waveform spiking, then flatlining in a way that made my chest cold when I watched it. I played the clip for a friend who promised to help. He listened to the file once and then stared at me. The expression on his face was not pity, and it was not belief. It was something between those two things, like the moment just before you listen for thunder after you smell the rain. He said, "Perhaps we should sleep at your place tonight." He did not offer to stay at mine. The nocturnal pattern altered when more than one person was present. It was subtle at first, a pause in the scratching when guests considered leaving, a laugh cut off mid-sentence, then back again as the front door clicked shut. It was as if the house registered witnesses and attempted to conserve the ritual by saving its work for the solitary hours. Yet privacy was where the thing had developed its language. It needed me alone to strike with a rhythm I had grown to dread. The presence of others seemed to mute it, and that made me greedy in a way I could not own. I began to wish for company, even as I knew company would blunt what I needed to watch in order to understand. Once a teenage boy came by from the neighborhood who dealt in small renovations. He arrived with a flashlight and a blunt comb. He tore the paper from one corner of my living room and climbed with slow professional care onto my ladder to inspect the cavity beyond the lamp, cut pale across studs and insulation, and he made small approving noises for a while, then went quiet. His flashlight beam passed over a table of old nails and a dark curve of shadow. I remember the boy looked up at me, his face slack, as if the scene had taught him anew vocabulary. He said, "You should not let the girls of the house write on the walls." And he did not mean my handwriting. He left quickly afterwards without finishing a cigarette. I learned to recognize the way the sound spoke to different materials. Drywall took a higher fretful tone, plaster sounded like soft gravel, wood thrummed like a distant insect. The wallpaper itself fed and changed timbre. With age, even stitches made to it altered the conversational pitch of the thing inside. When I shut my bedroom door, the scratching would climb with a malicious slowness toward the knob, as though testing the seal, and then continue its music on the other side, where the paper swallowed the sound and backed it into the room like a returning tide. The first time something came through the wall, rather than only scratching beneath, it was subtle enough that I almost missed the moment. The wallpaper along the upstairs landing had split into a thin crescent, and I had taken the step to peel it back using a blunt butter knife. It came away in a long, soft sheet, and I saw then the outline of fingernails traced in a faint line across the plaster, as if someone had tested the surface from the other side and left a rehearsal of marks. The nails were parallel and regular, and shadow of them lingered like an imprint. I swallowed and felt the air taste old. I pressed my ear to the plaster and listened, and the listening became a communion. My face was near the cold wall, and from beyond the paper, I felt the faintest vibration of breath. The watch on my wrist seemed loud and unimaginative by comparison. My fingers curled into the knife handle, and I had the strange flash of thinking this childlike habit of wanting to see would be the undoing of me, that the knowledge of what lay behind the paper would change me in ways I could not bargain for. When the scratches started forming in other rooms at precise intervals, I began to chart them, times and places mapped like constellations. Late night panels where the house announced itself. The map was useless and addicted me. I would sit with a tape recorder and a thermos of coffee and wait for the hum of that rasp in the dark. I slept less and watched more until the days folded into nights and days where I could no longer tell what hour my life belonged to. I became a nocturnal cartographer. The walls my subject, the marks my religion. It took 3 months in this rhythm before the first physical sign crossed into the house. Beyond scrapes and tears, something small appeared on a windowsill. A thin spiral of paper rolled like the skin of an onion. It was pale and smudged with soot. No one had been in that window, and yet the coil lay precisely where a courtyard light would not usually reach. I picked it up and tore it open and found that it contained nothing, only the faintest residue of old paint and a single short scratch scored across the inside, as if the coil itself were a representation of the walls trying to copy their masters. The coil sits in a drawer now, and every so often I open the drawer to look at it, and the coil has unrolled a little longer. By the end of part 2, I had a house with a grammar of scars and a life structured around listening. The wallpaper would not yield its secrets so easily. I learned that the more I forced the paper, the more deliberate the thing became, sharpening its scratches into sentences, and I understood with a clarity that felt like a stone in my chest that this would not stop of its own accord. If anything, the sound was steadying itself like a pendulum finding its proper swing, and I was the only person who kept time with it. The third phase began not with a new scratch, but with a sound I recognized in my chest before my ears registered it. The house hummed like an animal that had just been touched. The fingers beneath the wallpaper no longer confined themselves to nails. They beat, they tapped, they began to pick out rhythms, not unlike the stutter of a human tongue forming words. The first time I thought it was some old radio. The sound was so human, a staccato of taps that could have been a Morse code or a child drumming a finger, but it had no logic I could parse. At 3 a.m. on a rainless night, the tapping paused, and then a single soft syllable seemed to emit through the paper, a muffled thrum that the microphone on my recorder caught as a faint frequency. I played it back, and the waveform pinched to the spot where the syllable should have been, but no recognizable speech came through. Only a sign. That day, I visited an acoustic engineer at the university because the idea of unknown sound obsessed me. He brought equipment and threaded a sensitive microphone into the wall cavity. He asked a few questions about construction materials, about relative humidity. I told him nothing about breath or households in the 70s. He looked at the recordings and shrugged, then suggested thermal shifts of the wall might cause subtle contraction noises, which explained taps and creaks. He was polite and apologetic, and I left feeling ridiculous because the tapping that night had answered a rhythm I hummed by accident as I stirred my coffee, and the pattern had followed exactly the thing learned to answer me. I realized with horror and then curiosity. I would lightly beat one finger on the opposite side of the wall, and a scratch would respond with a complementary rhythm. It was like a game poorly designed to be harmless. Its answers grew more precise. I tapped a word, and the taps returned as if they had been taught the alphabet of my bones. The game escalated until one evening a long, slow phrase seemed to be spelled in the pauses, and when I played the recording back at half speed, a tone emerged like someone folding a paper to make a mouth and whispering into it. Neighbors began to bring stories, which meant whatever was happening here was not entirely private anymore. My neighbor from across the hall said his daughter woke in the night pointing at her bedroom wall, telling him there was someone behind it. He took off his shoes and stomped the floor like a man who thought force would obligate would to answer and later he came by and said the smell of old paint had moved through the vents. He said he had told the landlord he did not want to move, and then apologized for telling me at all, as if his words might sew me to the thing. Once, in a fit of reckless hunger, I scraped back a larger section of wallpaper. I had measured the hour so that the house would be in its most talkative mode. I used the sharp blade of a box cutter, and the paper ripped exactly where I intended, allowing me to see a strip of plaster as pale as a bone. The plaster had a series of shallow parallel lines, a pattern that did not look like claw marks, but like sentences carved with some blunt instrument. I photographed them, and in the photo the lines seemed fresher, darker, and there was a faint shadow that looked like the suggestion of a thumbprint pressed from within. I felt the hair on my arms stand up, and I felt foolish in that old frightened way a man feels when he finally knows what is under his bed. I thought the marks were my only real proof, until the day the house answered back in a very different voice. It began with a smell, a metal tang like pennies, and a faint odor of old milk. The house had never smelled of anything but cleaning fluid and the faint remainder of other people's colognes, but now a new perfume took hold, as if the paper itself exhaled it at odd hours. The smell curled in the nose and made the back of my throat tighten. Then one afternoon, while I sat at the kitchen table, the wallpaper at the edge of the dining room moved almost imperceptibly, like a breath exhaling. The movement was a pebble ripple, as if something pushed soft from behind, and I set my coffee down and watched it tremble. Then a line of faint wetness appeared near the baseboard, a thin trail like someone had dragged a finger through fresh varnish, and when I pressed my fingertip to it, the liquid came away dark on my skin. The taste was cold and metallic, and when I touched my tongue, there was a grit there that tasted like plaster and old ash. That night the scratches conspired to form a phrase, or what I wanted to believe was a phrase. I had done all the necessary stupid things. I had counted scratches and matched rhythms. I had recorded and replayed, and still the sentence emerged like someone offering a bargain in partial syllables each night. It fed me a syllable, just enough to keep me following a breadcrumb trail to its source. The first clear formation I could catch was the sense of a name, and then the sense of the word stay. It sounded like a voice learning how to use a mouth and using wooden consonants for vowels. I began to talk back to it, and that is how the voice learned to speak my language. The voice must have been listening for years, or perhaps it could simply adapt quickly to what it wanted. It repeated a phrase one night, and then another, and then over the span of days I realized that the scratches and the taps and the breaths were an attempt at composition. They wanted to be understandable, they wanted a reply, and each answer I gave emboldened. Then the first time it made me outright weep was the night the thing in the wall offered me memories. It did not speak them in sentences at first, but in images plastered into my skull. As if the paper projected a film. While I slept, I would dream of a small girl running her finger under a table and hiding a small wooden box inside a cavity. She pressed the box into the wood and then placed wallpaper scraps on top like a ghost of housekeeping. She covered the crime with offset pattern. It was my dream, and not my dream because the small girl in it had hands like mine, and yet a hairline scar that had been on my neighbor's hand for years. When I woke, I found a piece of wallpaper folded into a neat square on my dresser. Inserted in its fold was a sliver of dark wood notched with tiny letters I could not read. I stared until my eyes blurred, and then I placed the scrap in a shoebox with other scraps, and the box seemed to breathe with me. People began to stop visiting, they called, and then made excuses. I heard about barbecues and minor illnesses and new jobs, and while part of me resented their avoidance, I also understood their silence. It was easier to deny than to face the possibility that a hidden thing had been cultivating a vocabulary behind the paper in my home. I began to see the way. Strangers glanced at my door as if they reached for a made-up reason to stay away. The stigma of abnormality is a kind of insulation, and the house was becoming better insulated. Every week, I was being cut off from ordinary life at a small human economy of invitations and phone calls and sudden training sessions with my own shame. One night, as rain slapped the windows, the voice pushed farther than before, did not merely tap or whisper, it formed a cadence that matched my name, and it lined up the taps so that each one fell on the syllables exactly, as if someone had learned to break my name into fingers. The sound was in the wall, in the slap of rain, and in the hum of the refrigerator. It rapped and rapped until I could not distinguish source, and I stood with my palm on the paper and felt warm air leak out like an exhale, and the wall answered stay with a slow, patient pull of the paper toward me, as if a hand were curling behind it, and one of my fingers folded like a book. By the end of part 3, the wallpaper had become an interlocutor, a thing that could propose and bargain and show me scenes no one else had seen. The scratches grew more careful, as if a pen had replaced claws, and I found myself bargaining with the house as if it were a living being capable of motive. I promised small things like painting over old marks, and in exchange it rewarded me with memories and the promise of peace. I promised silence, then woke at 3 a.m. with the wall whispering my own voice back at me, answering the promises I had made. The house now knew the currency it sought: attention and trade, and I was in debt. I should have left by then. Any sane person would have packed their car and driven without looking back. But leaving felt impossible in a way I cannot explain. It was not money, it was not convenience. It was something deeper, as though the house itself wrapped its nails around me and whispered that I could not go. And every time I thought seriously about walking away, I would hear the scratching again, low and slow, as if reminding me that it was waiting. After the night, I saw the bulge in the wallpaper shift with the rhythm of breathing. I moved my mattress to the living room. I told myself it was temporary, but nights stretched into weeks, and I remained on the floor with only a thin blanket. The sound did not stay behind in the bedroom. It followed, spreading into the living room walls until I could hear scratching behind the family photos, behind the cheapwood shelves, behind the couch itself. I could not tell if it was one thing moving or many things at once. Sometimes it came from above me, the ceiling itself groaning faintly as if something dragged nails across plaster overhead. The tearing grew worse. Every morning I found new strips of wallpaper hanging down like dead skin. Sometimes long, curling ribbons, sometimes neat, symmetrical slashes. I taped some of them back, tried painting sections bare, but no matter what I did, the tears returned, and I could not ignore what I began to see beneath the paper. At first it looked like discoloration, dark stains bleeding through the plaster in strange shapes. But the longer I looked, the more those shapes resembled marks carved deep into the wall. Symbols I did not recognize. Some curved like broken circles, others sharp and jagged, as if carved with fury. They covered entire sections, layered over one another in patterns too deliberate to be chance. I tried to scrub them away. The blackness did not fade. I tried to sand them. The marks only seemed to grow darker, bleeding back through as though they were etched far beneath the surface, too deep for tools to erase. One night, I woke to the sound of soft thuds against the plaster. Not scratches this time. Knocks, slow and steady. They began on one wall, then another, circling the room like someone trapped inside was moving from place to place, rapping with their knuckles. I sat rigid with my blanket clutched around me while the knocking went on for nearly an hour. Then silence. The silence was worse. I began keeping a flashlight with me at all times. The house lights seemed to fail too often now, buzzing faintly before flickering to black. When the dark pressed and the scratching grew frantic, as if whatever was inside the walls grew excited. With the flashlight beam steady, I sometimes caught movement where the wallpaper hung loose. A ripple that passed across the surface too quickly to be caused by air. And then came the night. I heard the voice. It was faint at first, barely audible under the drag of nails. A whisper, low and hoarse, speaking from just beyond the paper. The words were wrong, twisted in a way that made my stomach lurch. They were not a language I recognized, but the sound carried rhythm, intonation, as though reciting something old and memorized. I pressed my palms against my ears, and yet the whisper seeped through, vibrating against my skull. The longer it went on, the more certain I became that it was not one voice, but several layered together, overlapping out of sync. A chorus too close, pressed into the hollow between walls. The next morning, I found every strip of wallpaper in the hallway torn down. The plaster beneath was raw with carvings, hundreds of overlapping marks that looked like claw scratches and symbols both. Some lines were deep enough to gouge through the plasterboard itself, exposing darkness inside. That was the first time I smelled it. A reek pouring from the gouges. Sour, damp, like rot left too long in stagnant water. It made me gag and stumble back, but even after I covered the holes with boards, the smell lingered faint and constant. I did not tell anyone. By then, I had stopped trying to explain. Friends had already stopped visiting. My co-workers whispered about how pale I looked, how distracted. I lied about bad dreams, about insomnia, anything to deflect their concern. How could I tell them that something unseen was wearing down the walls of my home? That voices spoke from behind plaster. One evening, while sitting in the dark living room, I felt the air change. Heavy, charged like before a thunderstorm. I aimed the flashlight at the far wall, just as a line appeared down the center of the wallpaper. A fresh tear forming before my eyes. The paper split downward slowly, deliberately, as though cut from the inside by invisible blades. Behind it, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement. Not shadow, not plaster. Something pale and wet sliding back into the dark cavity before the strip of wallpaper curled away completely. I do not know how long I sat frozen staring at that new opening. When I finally moved, the beam of the flashlight trembled so badly I could hardly hold it steady. Nothing remained but black gouges and torn paper. But know what I saw? I know it was not an illusion. The house no longer felt like mine. It no longer felt like a house at all. It was a husk, hollowed and infested with something that watched me every second. When I closed my eyes, I imagined dozens of what eyes pressed against the plaster, staring. I imagined nails scratching names into the walls that I was never meant to read. I began hearing sounds in the daytime, too. Soft dragging while I tried to make coffee. A knock just behind my head as I sat at my desk. Once I heard the whispering again while I showered, muffled by running water, yet clear enough to make me clutch the curtain with shaking hands. I stopped sleeping entirely. When exhaustion finally forced me to collapse, I woke minutes later to new tears in the wallpaper around me, as if sleep gave them strength. Now I sit in the kitchen writing this by hand, because every time I open my laptop, the screen fills with static. I do not know how to explain that. I do not know how long I can stay here. I hear scratching all around me. The walls are covered in wounds that will not close. Something is trying to get through. I fear the wallpaper was never decoration. I fear it was a covering meant to keep something in. And it is almost free. I have put this off for too long. My hands shake as I write this, but I have to get it down before it all slips away or before the walls swallow me too. The house is not safe any longer. It has not been safe for a long time, but now the thing that hid inside is no longer content to scratch. It wants more, and I know now that I was only ever meant to be here, so it could have someone to hear it, someone to notice it, someone to let it out. The last days have blurred together. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering calls. My phone lies dead and useless in the drawer, because whenever I turn it on, I heard faint scratching, even through the speaker, like the sound was coming through the wires themselves. The lights in the house no longer hold steady. They flicker until they burst, leaving black scorch rings in the bulbs. I keep the flashlight, but its batteries drain within hours. Sometimes I wake to find it switched on, even though I remember turning it off. The scratches are constant now. Not faint, not distant. Loud and deliberate, clawing at every surface of the house. They come from the ceiling, from the floorboards, even from the doors, as though the whole structure is only a thin shell containing what should not be here. The symbols beneath the paper cover nearly every wall now. The tears spread so quickly I stopped trying to repair them. I only walk past with my eyes low, because if I look too long at the carvings, my vision swims and my head fills with voices chanting in a tongue that makes my skin crawl. One night, I woke to the sound of tearing far louder than before. I turned my flashlight toward the hallway and froze. The wallpaper was not just curling this time. It was being peeled back in long strips by nothing. I could see the paper lifting from the plaster, stretching, ripping down as if unseen hands dragged it away. The sound filled the house, a storm of tearing, and beneath it all a wet, rasping breath that was not mine. I wanted to run, but when I reached the front door, I found deep scratches carved into the wood. Long vertical gashes that had not been there the night before. My hand trembled on the knob, but it would not turn. It was not stuck. It was not locked. It simply would not move, as though the house itself had decided I would not leave. I backed away and heard something inside the wall behind me shift. Not a mouse, not pipes. Something heavy sliding slowly down, like a body pressed into the hollow between drywall, dragging itself along in the space where nothing should fit. The breath followed it, hissing through the slits in the wallpaper. That was when I realized the thing had always been in the walls. Not outside, not beneath, inside, nesting, waiting. The smell grew unbearable, sour rot thick enough to choke me. It seeped from every opening, every gouge. My vision blurred, my skin prickled, and I could hear the whispering more clearly now. Not just one voice, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all layered and rasping as though a crowd pressed their mouths close to the plaster, chanting at once. The words meant nothing, but my bones recognized them, some ancient command that filled me with dread. I stumbled into the bedroom where it all began. The wall above the bed was no longer only torn. It bulged outward, distended as if something massive pushed from behind. The plaster cracked, the wallpaper stretched tight like skin ready to split. Scratches radiated from the center, fresh and wet, cutting deeper each second. I pressed myself against the far wall with the flashlight trembling in my grip. The bulge throbbed like it was breathing. The chanting grew louder until it filled my head, and I felt blood run from my nose. The air was so cold my breath came out in white clouds. Then the bulge split. The wallpaper ripped open in a jagged line from ceiling to floor. Darkness poured out, not just absence of light, but a thick presence that seemed to move on its own. And within that darkness, something shifted. Not a shape I can describe, not anything human or animal, but a mass of pale, wet limbs folding and unfolding, too many to count, bending wrong. Dozens of eyes glistened within, some too large, some too small, all rolling toward me at once. And the nails, long, black, curved, dragging across the plaster as they pulled the rest of the thing forward. It did not crawl. It did not walk. It slid, pouring itself from the wall as if the plaster had only been a thin membrane between this place and wherever it belonged. Its limbs stretched across the floor, leaving trails of dark slime. Its eyes blinked in sickening unison, and its voices rose into one, a howl that made the entire house shudder. I do not remember how long I stood frozen. The flashlight flickered and died, and I was left in the dark with only the glow of those eyes watching me. I felt nails scrape against my ankle, and I fell back screaming. But the thing did not strike. It only leaned close, so close that the stench filled my lungs, and whispered one phrase in a tongue I did not know yet understood perfectly. It said, "We are free." I must have blacked out because I woke hours later on the living room floor. The wallpaper was shredded from every wall. The carvings glowed faintly as though burned into the plaster. The house was silent, too silent, not even the scratching. But when I pressed my ear to the wall, I heard it again. Not scratching this time, not knocking, breathing, slow and steady, all around me, above me, beneath me, behind every wall. I do not think it left. I think tearing the wallpaper was never about escaping. It was about opening the way. The house is hollow now, not just walls and studs, but endless corridors behind the plaster, filled with whatever crawled through. I hear them moving. I feel them pressing when I sleep. Sometimes I wake with fresh scratches across my arms and chest, as though they reached through while I dreamed. I do not know how much longer I can remain, but I also know there is nowhere I can go, because sometimes when I stand in silence outside, far from the house, I swear I hear faint scratching beneath the skin of the world itself. The wallpaper was only the first layer. Now there's nothing to keep them back, and they are everywhere.